In this video, we are continuing with the pawn endings and we will speak about the key squares and how we can use them in order to achieve many wins or to draw against our opponents. Hello and welcome to another video on Better Chess Academy, your go-to destination for mastering the game of chess. Today we continue our series on the pawn endings and we are going to speak mainly about the key squares. It's really important to know about them because we can manage to calculate really quickly and effectively during our games. Before we start, I would like to ask you to like this video and hit the subscribe button if you are not a subscriber yet, and also to join our team on Lichess where we are going to start playing some team matches. So, with all that said, we are ready to go. In the previous video, which I would like to advise you to see if you have not seen it yet, we saw positions that the king is behind the pawn. Now we are going to focus on positions that the king is in front of the pawn. And usually this is something we are aiming for when we are having the pawn. We aim for positions where our king is in front of it. And let's start with the most basic one. The rule says that if the king is in front of the pawn on the 6th rank or the 3rd rank for black, then it's always a win. If it's white to move, then he moves king e6, king e8 and d6, and we reach the position from our previous video with the pawn in the 6th rank plus the opposition, so it's a win. If however black played king c7, then king e7 and our pawn is going to promote. If it's black to move, then we use the advice again from the previous video and we are stepping forward and we open the path for the pawn on the other side. So if king c8 we play king on e7 and d6 and queen, and if king e8 we move from the other side, we play king on c7 and then the pawn moves forward. However, if the pawn is on the edge, this is an exception again. Even if we are in front of the pawn, it's not sufficient for a win. It's king g6, king g8, h6, king h8 and h7. And again it's stalemate. So if the king is in front of the pawn on the 6th rank, it's always a win, except if we have a pawn on the edge. And now we are going to see a very important position. I have seen many players, even 17, 1800 to make this wrong. So we should decide where we should place our king. We have two moves, king on f6 and king on h6. It seems like it's the same, but it's not. You can think for a few seconds. The correct move is king h6, but why? Black is going to play king h8 and we are going to play g6, g7 and queen or pawn. However, if you chose to play king on f6, black has an amazing resource, king h7, and now we cannot play g6, because if g6, black plays king h8, and it's a draw, because we cannot play king f7, it's a stalemate. However, we can still win with white if we play king f7, king h8, king g6, king g8, and now we reach the initial position where we should play our king on h6. So you have to remember, when we have the g pawn and we have to choose to go to the side, to the edge, or to the center, we go to the edge. King h6 is the move. And now we are going to discuss what happens if it's the king one square in front of the pawn. So if I ask you in this position, who wins? What's the result? Is it a draw or white wins? The correct answer is it depends. It depends on who is to move. So, in this position, whoever has the position reaches his goal. So, if it's white to move, white plays king f4 for example, and black takes the position again and it doesn't let the opponent come forward. So at some point white will have to move the pawn forward, and now it's king behind the pawn with an easy defensive technique we learned on the previous video. So what happens if it's black to move, however? Then black loses, and the secret to win is to move our king as far as possible while opening the path for our pawn. So if black plays king d6, not king d4, but we go on the other side. We outflank the opponent. King f5, king e7, and now we take the opposition again. King e5, king f7, king d6, king e8. If king f6, then we have e4. And if king e8, then we reach the position where we have our king in front of the pawn on the 6th rank. We know it's always a win, except of the pawn on the edge. So we just push our pawn, and it's a win. Now, what happens if the king is 2 squares in front of the pawn? What is the result in this position? If you answer that it depends on who moves, you are unfortunately wrong. The correct answer is that white wins no matter who has the move. Because if it's black to move, then it's easy. If black plays king e7, we go king c6. If king c7, we go king e6. And if it's white to move, the king is 2 squares in front of the pawn. So he can just play d4. And now the king moves on e7, we move forward on c6, and it's a win for white. So when the king is 2 squares in front of the pawn, it's always a win. Except if we have the h pawn or a pawn. So now we are going to speak about the key squares. In pawn endings, in order to know which side wins or draws, we should know the key squares theory. The key squares are these that if the king with the pawn steps on one of them, then it's a win. For example, now if white had a king on f5, it's a win. Or on c4 if he had the b2 pawn. So, how do we know which are the key squares? The key squares, if the pawn has not reached the center of the board, are the ones that are 2 ranks in front of the pawn, right and left. For example, for the pawn on b2, the key squares are b4, a4 and c4. For the pawn on f3, the key squares are e5, f5 and g5. So, when the pawn has passed the center, the key squares are 1 rank in front of it. So, we already knew that because we said that when the king has reached the 6th rank and it's in front of the pawn, it's a win. But now we know from the key squares theory. Let's move on to some exercises. Here it's white to play and win. And we know that the key squares are d6, e6 and f6 since the pawn hasn't passed the center. And how we are going to reach them. If you chose e5, you are correct because we threatened to go to all key squares. And if king d7, we play king f6, king e8, king e6, and the pawn can queen. If you chose, however, king d5, it's a mistake because black plays king d7, and now we cannot pass. If we play king e5, king e7, and it's a draw. And now let's make defense. It's white to move, and he should defend the key squares. There is only one move that draws, so I will let you think for a few seconds. The correct move is king on f1. We take the distant opposition. We said that the opposition is when we have an odd number of squares between the kings. Now we have 3 squares between them. Because if we moved on f2, then black plays king f4, king e2, king e4, and king d2, king f3. And now the pawn is going to queen. If king f1, however, then black cannot reach the key squares, which are d3, e3 and f3. He's going to play king e4, and now we play king e2, we take the position, and if king d4, king d2, king e4, king e2. And it's a draw. Now, let's discuss about the key squares for the pawn on the edge. They are the one that is 1 square diagonally from the corner and 1 square next to the corner. If the king which has the pawn reaches one of these squares, it's a win. So it's very easy. White to play and win. The move is king on f6. And if king e8, king g7, king e7, h5, h6 and h7. Now we have to make defense. If it's white to play, and if it was black, he would play king d2 and he would win. So we have to prevent this from happening. We are playing king on f1. If h4, now king g1 and the king reaches the corner, so it's an easy draw. And if king h2, we should just remember that we have to stay on the squares f2 and f1. So we just wait. If king g3, we play king g1 and we reach the corner. And if h3, we wait. And now it's a stalemate, and it's the side with the pawn that gets stalemated. So these were the examples, and we're going to make a quick review. So we said that when the king is in front of the pawn on the 6th rank, it's always a win, except if it's a pawn on the edge. We also said about this exception that we have to choose whether to go on the edge of the board or towards the center. We choose to go to the edge of the board in order to avoid king f6, king h7, g6, king h8. Next up, we talked about the case when the king is one square in front of the pawn. What matters is who has the opposition. If it's white to play, it's a draw. If it's black to play, it's a win for white. And when the king is two squares in front of the pawn, it's always a win, except if we have a pawn on the edge. Then we play d4 and we reach a winning position. The key squares when the pawn has not passed the center are two ranks in front of it, right and left. Whereas when the pawn has passed the center, the key squares are one rank in front of it. So we made some exercises, and we've also talked about the key squares for the h pawn. So this was the video for today. I hope you like it. If so, then hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel in order to help. Thank you very much, and I'm also waiting for comments in order to tell me what you expect to see next. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next video.